Great. Welcome to the latest ACM Sustaining Belonging workshop. My name is Alan Linton, Senior Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at the Associated Colleges of the Midwest, and excited to be convening everyone again around another topic of importance and relevance to our institutions. Before we get started, just a couple of small notes. If you have any questions or issues with tech, let me know. Send me a message in the chat. I'll be monitoring that. You can send it directly. You can just put it in the chat and we can try to support that. We know that we're meeting over the lunchtime for many of you all. So if you want to eat, feel free. It's okay. There'll be time for question and answer at the end, but certainly feel free to use the chat to surface topics that come up. And for more information about the series and recordings, just this recording as well as previous Sustaining Belonging workshops, you can always visit acm.edu and look for our virtual workshops under the Professional Development tab. Without further ado, really excited to introduce Ryan A. Miller, Associate Professor of Higher Education in the Department of Educational Leadership at UNC at Charlotte. Ryan, this is a really big honor for us, and it's raising and presenting on a topic that has really garnered a lot more attention lately in a space where faculty and staff together can grow. So we're looking forward to a great presentation. I'll just turn it over to Ryan. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Alan. So hopefully folks can see and hear me now. So thanks for that welcome. I really appreciate it. And yeah, thank you for making this happen, Alan. I appreciate it. Also, shout out to the other folks at ACM. Shout out to my friend and colleague, Lisa Jasinski, who's a phenomenal leader who I've learned so much from. So you all are very lucky to have her on board. I was also taking a look at some of the other presentations that you've had in this series, and it looks like a really phenomenal series. And some folks I know, and some folks I didn't know, but all of the topics look great. And I'll say too. So I know when this talk was advertised, I had the first part of the title, Supporting Disabled Students in Higher Ed. I added, this was a last minute addition because I kind of changed things up until the last minute, holistic and intersectional approaches, because that's really my specific focus that we'll talk about. So viewing our students as whole people, in the context of their multiple identities, right? And I think the other workshops in the series, if you've been able to attend or watch recordings, really fit in well with that, right? This idea that, okay, we're talking about disabled students today, and disabled students can also be first-generation students, and many are. They can also be LGBTQ students, and many are. They can also come from rural areas. So I just wanted to note that I think the series outline looks great. I have on my slide here some contact info. I'm on Blue Sky and still on X or Twitter for the moment, but you can get in touch with me there afterwards if you like. I also have my email address there, and I am in Charlotte, North Carolina, where it is rainy and a little chilly, but not snowy. And so I know all of you may be experiencing different weather today. I'll also mention too, if you are anything like me, when a presenter is talking for a little bit, sometimes I like to be on camera and kind of nod and smile and be supportive. And I love that, but I will say I've got my PowerPoint going, so I won't actually see your face. So please feel free, if you don't want to be on camera and you want to keep it off and eat your lunch or whatever and be supportive that way, that is fine too. So please don't feel pressure to keep your camera on, because I probably just won't be able to see you at the moment. But hopefully when we pivot toward the end to some Q&A and discussion, I'll stop sharing screen and I'll be able to see everyone's lovely faces. So yeah, so I will dive in here. This is what was advertised, what you signed up for. So again, this is a huge topic, so I'm just going to scratch the surface on some of these issues, hopefully give you some considerations to think about, bring back to your campuses. And it's really, I thought about, I have some implications at the end. I'm not so much of like a list of best practices kind of person, but I hope there are some ideas and mindsets that maybe it confirms some of what you're already doing, or maybe it causes you to think a little differently about disability in higher ed. And I know too that all of this is very campus and context specific. So there is no one size fits all, no magic bullet for supporting this population or any other, as you know. But we're going to talk again a lot about the intersections of identities that disabled students come to campus with, some current developments in higher ed, and I think some of that is woven throughout, like the research is pretty current. I'm going to share with you a few things that aren't even published yet. But I also hope that maybe in the Q&A at the end, that might be a space to also get further into current developments. And again, some promising practices. There are some ideas on some slides. I have like questions for consideration. So I hope all of this is helpful to you today. And thanks for attending. I know there's a lot of other things folks can be doing with their lunch hour, with their time today. So I appreciate it. So in terms of the overview, I will share very briefly about me. I'll do some kind of framing terminology. I don't want to assume, I know folks probably come to this session with a variety, with different levels of knowledge around disability and awareness about it. And so I want to start with some almost like more 101, and we'll go beyond that, but I just want to start there so that we have some common language for the discussion. For the bulk of the time, I will share what I call some snapshots from my research. So again, some recent studies, some studies that haven't been published yet related to these topics, and then we'll start to wrap up with some considerations and implications and moving into Q&A and open discussions. That is the plan. So I want to ask you, if you don't mind, so this is a poll everywhere setup, and I wanted to ask you about what brought you here today. Why did you choose to attend this particular session? And let me see here, I think, and I am going to also, depending on your setup, so I put the link in the chat as well. So that is the question if you want to send in a response, and hopefully this will work. That's, my fingers are always crossed with technology, right? So you can send your response online, or there's other options listed there on the screen as well, but I put the link in the chat. And we will give that a second, and hopefully some responses will come in. And or you can let me know that this is not working. Oh, it is working. Great. Learning about how I can adapt my work to better support disabled students. Excellent. Interested in all the topics from ACM. Yep, it's an important and timely topic. Curiosity is always a good place to start. Working with students with disabilities. So someone mentions being new in the role and learning the scope. Helping disabled students. General idea of what's new. Great. Yeah. Someone mentions as a student with disability, it's an important issue and we want to create a better community. Supporting students in peer-led support centers, increasing awareness. Excellent. Well, thank you all for contributing these. Thinking about language and terminology. So that's already good confirmation for me that it's important not to skip over that step. Being supportive of students' ideas. Supporting students with disabilities campus-wide. Yes, I will emphasize that as a campus-wide effort. Supporting students with disabled students I manage. Yep. Excellent. Well, and this also shows me, thank you all for that. This also shows me that for some of you, disability services or accessibility services might be, that might be a central part of your work that you're, employed by the institution to do. For some of you, that might be part of your work. For others, it may not be directly in your job description, right? But I would argue it's all of our responsibility in higher ed, right? These are all our students. And no matter what role we might play on our campus, I think we can think about that. And I think it's important, shout out to those of you who might work in disability resource offices or accessibility offices. Those are often roles that are that have a lot on their plates. There's a lot of legal mandates. There is a lot to keep up with that changes. There's a lot to manage with students and with other partners on campus and working with faculty. Those offices also are often, not always, but many times they might be understaffed and sort of overloaded. So again, shout out, appreciation for the work. And I want to say if that's not your role, it's important, I think, in higher ed to remember, again, these are all our students. And so it's not that students with disabilities are the sole province of your disability resource folks. So just to affirm that and say out loud what, we probably all agree on that already. So thank you very much. Um, I'll move just a second. Okay, to the next slide about me. By the way, we're going to do, toward the end, toward the Q&A, we're going to do just one other poll everywhere. So if you have that window open, or want to keep that somewhere handy, you can do that. So I am 17 years into the game in higher ed, and my experience has been at this point, pretty evenly split between the first 8 years full-time student affairs practitioner, primarily in DEI-focused roles, supporting minoritized student groups and educating campus communities about those identities. And so that included various roles with TRIO student support services, working with students with disabilities, low income, and first-gen students. That include working with bias response programs at a university, intergroup dialogue, being a facilitator of that. And also, it included my very first role after my master's. I was down in Florida at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville, where I was hired to coordinate a fairly new LGBT resource center. And so I came to that role with a lot of, early career energy and excitement and idealism. And I worked with phenomenal students. I realized in that role that I hadn't necessarily been prepared through my education and my professional development to fully support the students who were coming through the door at the LGBT Center. So I had been doing a lot of work in LGBT communities and student work and grad work for several years. But there were lots of, again, supporting students in their multiple identities. Lots of queer students of color were in the space. Lots of LGBT students with various disabilities were active in the space. And so that was a moment for me early on in my career when I said, I need to know more about this. And that moment became a thread that sort of carried throughout my career. So when I eventually was working on a PhD, and I had looked at the literature and said, the literature really isn't talking about this intersection for LGBT students who also have disabilities. That became the focus of that identity intersection, became the focus of my dissertation, a lot of my professional and scholarly work in higher ed, and I still do a lot of work specifically around that intersection that I'll share a little bit. And so that sort of kicked off a lot of it. I try to ask research questions that would matter to practitioners. And so I think back in this 9 years now as a faculty member, I try to think back to those 8 years as as a practitioner and say, okay, if and when I can share and publish this, is this something a practitioner could pick up and find some way to use or some way to, maybe challenge their thinking. So that's how I try to approach my work. I look at how systems of oppression shape the experiences of minoritized groups. Again, lots of work around queer and trans students, lots of work around disabled students. This other thread of my agenda is how I used to say it's just how colleges do diversity. It's how they institutionalize equity efforts on campus. And I've looked at bias response. I've looked at undergraduate diversity requirements in the curriculum that many of our colleges have. So how do colleges attempt to embed that right in the fabric of the institution? Unfortunately, lately, you'll see I've added the to undo in parentheses. In the last few years, the march is going the other way, right? Toward deinstitutionalization, scrubbing the words diversity, equity, and inclusion from websites, from programming, from policies. And so that's something that my agenda has also evolved to look at that. And I probably won't, I may not get the chance to share as much about that part of my agenda today, but in the Q&A again, we can talk about it too. So I come from my educational background. So I was at UT Austin for a while. That's where I got my PhD. I also earned a portfolio in disability studies at UT Austin. It aligned so well with my dissertation work. I was thrilled that it was offered. And it really changed the way I thought. Yes, hook 'em, absolutely. The disability studies program at UT Austin really changed a lot of the way I was thinking about disability, caused some realizations, helped the direction of my work, and we'll talk about how it sort of did that. But I wanted to mention that. And I think it's important to think about my identities, all of our identities, right? So I encourage you too to think about your identities and how you enter the conversation, right? So I'm a white, queer, cisgender, non-disabled man. I was a first generation college grad, and I think that informs a lot of my work in higher ed. That I like to ask questions about why we're doing things. I don't like to hear it's just because that's how we've always done it. So I think that's the first gen in me. And I also reflect relative to this work on my many privileged identities. I'm a person with a lot of those, and I think specifically with respect to disability, being non-disabled is an interesting place to be to do this work. Feeling, navigating trust with communities that I work with, and trying to not just say, but demonstrate a commitment to disability justice. So not just talk, but action as much as possible. And knowing disability, it's an interesting category because if we live long enough, if we're not already in this category, if we live long enough, basically all of us are going to enter this category. So I think just from that perspective of this is something that can change and evolve over the life course, I think it's interesting to study. There is my Google Scholar page, which is linked from the faculty page that I think Alan might have shared out, and I think I can put it in the chat here. I'm going to mention some of the publications I have, and so this Google Scholar page will link to some of them. But if there are any that you can't find that like aren't accessible to you, let me know, like follow up afterwards, and I can always email you them as well. But wanted to share that with you. I also think one quick note, I know there's a lot of preamble. I want to note too, again, like I'm encouraging, like let's think differently about disability. My research and my professional work, again, it hasn't been in like the disability services space. So I have focused on cross-disability community, on issues of identity. So that's what I'm going to speak mostly toward. It's sort of out of my lane in a lot of ways to talk about like specific impairments, diagnoses, specific accommodations, right? So that's just not where my expertise has been. So I think it's important to just set expectations around that. But again, I know either you all have this knowledge or you have excellent folks on your campus who can pick up where I leave off as well. All right. So in terms of terminology, what's in a name? So you may be familiar with this notion of person-first language that is very common in the United States, commonly used when we talk about disability. And I've got some examples here of that. I'm a man who has ADHD, or I'm a person with a disability. Essentially, you center the person first, hence the name, right? So that disability is not at the center. We also see this in institutional names of offices. So some of you may have an office or a program with a name like Services for Students with Disabilities, that again, you're putting the student first in that particular instance. So this has been a positive development compared to dehumanizing language around disability that unfortunately has a very long history. However, there are alternatives to person-first language. And so one alternative that more and more over the years that I've started to use is disability-first or identity-first language. So examples of that, like if someone said, I am autistic, I am a disabled woman, you see the difference there, right? That it's kind of putting disability front and center. Maybe if your office is named the Disability Resource Center, that's another example that sort of puts it front and center. And the idea here is that why a lot of folks use this language is that disability is not something to be ashamed of. And so this is a way to, again, sort of literally put disability front and center or first. It's a way of highlighting disability pride for a lot of people, highlighting the effects of ableism. Now, of course, around terminology, there's no like one correct way to do this. But there's, of course, a few ways to navigate this, right? First and foremost, respecting individual self-identification. So, if somebody, whatever terminology they're using, if it's person first or disability first, to really respect that. This can happen at the group level too, say a student organization, or you're facing decisions about what to name the office, right? It gets tricky at the group level because not every individual in the group may agree and use all of this language, right? There's a lot of disagreement within disability communities and subpopulations about which should be used. you will find, and I do this sometimes in my work, I'll acknowledge the differences, but I might use person first and disability first language interchangeably. Language is evolving and changing. I don't need to tell you all that. And so this is where we are, right, at the start of 2025, and that's going to change over the months and years. In all cases, I would say, I think it's pretty important to avoid, there's sometimes these like euphemisms we use for disability. It's almost like it positions to me like disability is a bad word that we shouldn't say. And so sometimes like someone say, oh, people with diverse abilities or differently abled. And I generally, again, these are not like rules, but those are just terms that I try to avoid because I feel like they kind of avoid saying disabled. And again, disabled is not a bad word. So again, I know I'm going to try to think about how to connect this to your work. So this may cause you to think about, what do you call your office or your program or events around disability? It might, actually a great program could be around language and, what language do people use and what are the pros and cons, right? Another term that I've already used is, and of course it's misspelled on my slide. Please forgive my misspelling. It's ableism, able and then ISM. So misspelled on the title there, but spelled correctly in the bullet. So here I'm talking about the oppression of disabled people. That happens on multiple levels, right? It happens in basically all of society's institutions. It happens on the interpersonal level in our interactions with each other. It happens in the legal system, the political system, media, religion. You name a social institution, and there's probably a history and maybe current practices, right, of ableism and norms that we have around this. So I think it's important to use that word to name this, and you'll see it throughout the presentation. Um, there's a book that I'll recommend and I'll share with you on another slide, the cover of this book from Jay Dolmage. It's called Academic Ableism. And the author, he does a really phenomenal job, I think, he has this line of disability has always been constructed as the inverse or opposite of higher education. And I think that history he traces, that creates a lot of the problems that we see, that when our campuses are not accessible in many ways, right? Or essentially it's that I think to really paraphrase some of his arguments, right? It's like higher ed is not set up for disabled people. So this is what we're working against. It's not just, bad intentions or good intentions, but working against really a system. Again, ableism helping us to have the language of this is systematic. This is not just a few bad actors or, oh, our buildings are old and we haven't updated them, right? It goes deeper than that. It's part of a larger system. And so the result of that, right, is the exclusion, invisibility, unfortunately, sometimes hostility or limited inclusion of disabled students, employees on many of our campuses. And so we can think about that. We often think about it in terms of architecture or physical spaces. It's also in our curriculum, our co-curriculum and activities, even in diversity discourses, right? So some institutions, it's changing now again with current events, but sometimes the chief diversity officer has a certain portfolio. Sometimes disability is included as sort of an aspect of human diversity, and sometimes it's not. Ironically, and we'll get to this later with current events, but I was thinking for a long time, this is not a good thing that it's not included. Sometimes it could actually be a positive thing, but it plays out differently, right? And we'll get into that and the reasons why. I mentioned also, so I had the great fortune in my doctoral studies of getting into disability studies, and so this is sort of an outlook and perspective. It's an academic field of study. It's very interdisciplinary, and it's really focusing, again, I mentioned my expertise. It's focusing less on diagnosis, impairment, specific information about specific impairments and what that means in the context. More, it's about the social, cultural, political aspects of disability. It's about disability pride, viewing disabled people as a political group, as a social minority group, and emphasizing the way disability is constructed. So again, that's all sort of I think it's fair to say, opposition to the physiology of impairment. Um, Simi Linton, one prominent disability studies scholar, says it's about the subjectivity and agency of disabled people. and again, encourages people to view disability as a tenet of diversity. I'll mention I was involved for several years. Some of you may be familiar with ACPA, College Student Educators International, so one of the big student affairs associations. I was involved for several years with their Coalition for Disability. I bet in any, just whatever your functional area, if you have a large, maybe national professional association, you might see, do they have a knowledge community, an interest group, a coalition around disability? And also, even if you're not disabled, that's something that is probably very welcoming for folks who want to learn more and who want to take action around this. So I'll make that quick plug as well. If you are part of ACPA, they have a great coalition for disability, but many others exist too. Um, so again, a consideration for your campus. Some of you may already have disability studies courses or a minor or a program on your campus, and that is fantastic. Some of you may not. So you might think about, are there ways you can introduce disability studies? And I'm not saying you necessarily have to have a major and a minor overnight. That's not how it works. But, could you bring in a disability studies scholar to campus, to work with students and faculty and staff? So are there programs and events, or maybe there's someone with the expertise to offer like an introductory course in disability studies that might be interesting. And those often, not always, but often reside alongside or in the tradition of ethnic studies and Black studies, queer studies, women's studies. So again, those are often, I would say, programs and faculty that you might be able to find partners or find some expertise there as well. To elaborate again on sort of disability studies, so there are these different approaches to thinking about and conceptualizing disability that this slide outlines. And, so I think on this left-hand side, I have this list of sort of not disability studies. If we think of this as a spectrum from on one side of the screen, this is not really disability studies, for the other side being like this is. So, models that I've talked a lot about, so models of disability that entirely focus on the medical aspects of disability. Sometimes these models focus on this idea of quote unquote, sort of curing someone of a disability or fixing them, right? Or focusing a heavy focus on what are the particular functional limitations someone has. The medical model is really tied up with legal models and definitions in a lot of ways. And I think these are very pervasive in higher education, right? So many of our disability services programs, accessibility offices, or whatever office you have that administers accommodations and makes decisions about that for students and employees is probably, and this is not like an indictment of it, but probably that core function is often guided by medical and legal models because we rely on a lot of legal definitions under various laws that have been passed through the years of what institutions are obligated to provide, right? Reasonable accommodations. And I always want to have the both and in this conversation because those are important. Those are legally mandated services. Those are, even if they weren't legally mandated, I hope our institutions would provide them, right? My emphasis here is not to say that, we can or should throw all of that out, but that we can also think about disability in other ways and frame it in different ways that are not just focused on the individual and what they need to succeed, right? There are other models of disability, like the social model, that says, a lot of the problems disabled people run into are because of the way we constructed our environment and society, right? If you can't get into the building, without substantial effort, that is a problem. If you don't see yourself reflected in the curriculum as a disabled person, that's a problem. If class, is only delivered in one modality, and you never get to fully participate because of your particular body, mind, or disabilities you might have, that's a problem, right? So all of these models on the right hand of the screen acknowledge that and sort of, they go beyond this medical and legal model and say, again, disability can be a marker of identity. It can be something that is empowering, that folks are really proud of, an aspect of human diversity, right? There are also, in recent years, I've really gravitated, you see this person plus environment, the interactionist perspective. I think this is, for me, like a lot of times, sort of the best of both worlds that you say, yes, the environment is often disabling, and even if we had somehow a universally designed, perfectly accessible environment, which is hard to think of how we would even do that, but even if we had that sort of utopia, folks still have impairments, right? That have bodily realities, that have realities in our bodies and our minds. So again, it's not that having a perfectly accessible environment doesn't take that away, but it can make someone's experience of that impairment easier and hopefully make that experience of the impairment less disabling or not disabling in a particular context. So again, lots of possibilities here along sort of a spectrum, right? So again, with this idea of thinking differently about disability. I also, to frame some of the snapshots that I'll give you in just a minute as we move into that, I again am probably pretty confident that most folks on the call are familiar either on some level, right, with the term intersectionality. And we often talk about Kimberly Crenshaw as, the lead scholar who really coined the term and talked about it in critical legal studies. Looking at the important thing here that is sometimes missed about intersectionality. Yes, we are talking about people's experiences, but we're also taking it up a level to the systematic, the systemic. So when Kimberly Crenshaw writes about Black women being theoretically erased, yes, it centers Black women's experiences and it centers the systematic and the power structures, right? So it centers racism and sexism and where they intersect and what that means for folks who reside at the intersection. So sometimes we see it's become sometimes a buzzword, sometimes a misused word, I would argue, in higher ed. And it's important to go back to the roots of that and think about, okay, we are talking about systems of power, how they overlap, how they inform the experiences, again, of folks who are targeted by multiple systems of oppression. So again, some of the ideas here that we would center the voices of people of color and groups that are multiply marginalized and oppressed. Always talking about this within larger systems. So social justice is the goal. And for that, we have to focus on these systems of power that are happening, right? And I think, hopefully a discussion of intersectionality prompts us to think about, how are we focusing on the needs, especially of disabled students of color on our campuses? Um, and that's one example, right? There are also, other disabled students who are targeted by multiple systems of oppression and navigating those multiple realities, right? So that's a term, again, we'll continue to use throughout here. So here's an idea for on campus too, that maybe you want to have a book club or a common reading around disability to bring some of this out into the forefront. I sometimes use the term like centering disability, like moving disability from the margins of our campus to the center. And there's a lot of ways to do that, right? There are some great books and readings that are out there, and these are just a few that I frequently use, consult, read. So one is Disability in Higher Ed, a Social Justice Approach. I think it was published in 2017. I cite from it, I write with it all the time. And I know that one of the authors, Autumn Wilkie, is at Grinnell, so a member institution, of the ACM. So definitely wanted to note that and give Autumn a shout out, Dr. Wilkie. So phenomenal book that I think it has everything that I covered in just a brief period about the terminology, the models, all of that. This book does it in a beautiful job, in a really beautiful way, and I think it's really user-friendly. You don't have to read it from cover to cover. You can take a chapter and sort of, discuss that in your office and look at some of what. It's just a phenomenal, really current overview. These next two books are really examples of disability studies scholarship in the field and specific studies around disability. I mentioned Jay Dolmage and Academic Ableism. Again, phenomenal book talking about the relationship of disability to higher education. He traces the history of this. He traces current ways that history sort of still manifests in defining academic ableism. The second one, Margaret Price, Crip Spacetime. She has there's another book she has. This is her most recent one. And she focuses a lot in on the experiences of disabled employees in higher ed, particularly faculty with disabilities in higher ed. And it's really, again, I can't say enough good things that if you have any interest, that it's a great book. This last one here is a book I'm reading right now. It is a, I don't have it downstairs, but with me, but it is a, I will say, and in comparison to the other books, it's shorter and thinner. So it may be less intimidating, in that respect. And so Against Techno-Ableism by Ashley Shue, who's a professor at Virginia Tech, I believe. And it's fairly recent. I think it just come out in the last year or two. And in the book, the author really talks about how sometimes technology is celebrated as like, oh, this is the, again, I'll use the word cure, quote unquote. Like this is going to change disability, right? And you can think about specific disabilities where there's a relationship between disability and technology. The author's experience is as an amputee with multiple disabilities and talking about how prosthetics are heralded as, oh, it'll be like you're not even disabled. And that's not quite the case, right? So this book too, I will say it's coming from a professor, but it is very conversational. Again, a great one that you could pick a chapter to. She has a great chapter on neurodiversity that I just finished reading. I think it would be a really nice one that for students, for staff, for faculty, just a great one. So I wanted to share some of those that are on my shelf and that I think also inform some of my own thinking. Okay, some snapshots of my scholarship. I'll just get right into it. So I have a manuscript that it's coming out in a book that I think the title is The New Accessibility, and it's not out yet, but it's going to come out this year. And so the authors and I worked with some colleagues on this chapter and really sort of highlighted what is some of the intersectional work around disability in higher ed. And so just briefly, I'll share, what are some of the takeaways of that, right? And throughout these identities, we talk about how history informs, again, these particular relationships. So for instance, there's a relationship around ableism and racism that we can look to the eugenics movement and efforts, frankly, to eliminate these identities, eliminate these people. And again, I won't go into details, but a really painful history there that I think is important to acknowledge right off the bat, right? Um, we see in a lot of disability research, and my colleague Lissa Stapleton has called this out, that often we see disability research that highlights mostly white participants. I think this is another consideration we can think about for our work on campuses of when we think about disability or who we're highlighting or maybe who our offices are serving, is it mostly white students who are disabled or not? Are we again meeting the needs of disabled students of color? The new research we have available has highlighted some of these deficit narratives, but also that students have to navigate, and also some of the microaggressions, macroaggressions that disabled students of color navigate. The upside, to this is, there are models out there for resisting, right, ableism and racism. So this idea of campus making, so reimagining campus spaces akin to Black placemaking, is discussed in the literature, right? And I think this is a great challenge to all of us. How do we create those opportunities for expression, resistance, and joy? And again, disability pride on oppressive or exclusionary campuses. So a great piece talking about that one. We also in the chapter highlight intersections around disability and social class or classism. And, disability is very much tied up with social class, right? If we look at employment statistics, disabled folks in our society are unemployed or underemployed at much higher rates than our non-disabled counterparts. When we think about that in relationship to higher education, right? I'm going to go back to the medical model, the legal model that I mentioned earlier that often governs our accommodations in higher ed. Those processes often require from students a lot of time and money to get to the point of receiving an accommodation, right? So typically a medical or legal process that we might use relies on proof or relies on documentation of a disability. So it's often not viewed as sufficient enough that, it's often not just self-report, right? And so what that means, depending on what someone's impairment is, that they may be spending a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of resources to maybe have testing, done from medical providers, to then have the documentation to then bring to the higher education institution. So that right off the bat is a barrier, right, that many of our students may face. And in that way, it's not an exaggeration to say, where social class and disability intersect, impacts, is your institution accessible and affordable, right? So always something to think about, and to see, can the institution pay for testing? What are ways, right, to minimize, the burden that is on students? My colleague Anne-Marie Vaccaro conducted a great study around class and disability, and she said the students with social class privilege had confidence in their abilities and their, projected a happy future. Those disabled folks from lower socioeconomic backgrounds were thinking about basic needs. So those daily things to navigate of, what do I have to eat? Do I have sufficient housing? Is it safe and secure? So again, I know I'm happy that there's been a recent push the last few years on campus to more so acknowledge basic needs, especially student hunger, student housing insecurity. And so when you address those issues, those are disability justice issues, and we can explicitly sort of link those, right? Yes, you're supporting all students that go through that, but know that that is an issue around disability as well. Um, Around, sexism and misogyny and patriarchy. So this is another area that we reviewed in the literature. And what do, in particular, disabled women facing limited opportunities, lower expectations, and reduced supports? We know that, again, in terms of thinking of where do ableism and patriarchy sort of intersect or overlap. So one is restriction of women's opportunities and choices and livelihood. That's enforced through threats of violence, right? And that's, yes, I'm talking, big picture in society, but it happens in our higher ed institutions too. Several scholars have looked at sexual assault and unwanted sexual contact, and with findings that disabled students and disabled women, and I believe also LGBTQ students with disabilities, are facing higher rates of that victimization and unwanted sexual contact. So again, when we think about Title IX, when we think about our campus efforts against sexual assault, the more we can support those and be identity conscious in supporting them, that's a disability justice issue. So I'll spend just a few minutes talking about some work that has been a big part of my career, as I mentioned, around these intersections of homophobia and transphobia and ableism. And so I've done quite a few studies looking at the experiences of LGBTQ students with disabilities. And again, I come at it from sort of an identity development, identity management perspective. And one of my studies that was the centerpiece of my dissertation was really looking at how do students holding these multiple identities, how do they view those identities? How do they articulate them to others? And I know there's a lot here on the screen, and I won't go into detail about everything, but I found in my research these 5 particular intersectional identity perspectives that these students were using. I was studying, so again, LGBTQ and disability. There may be potential that I haven't done this research, but this could also potentially apply to other identities, right? So some participants in the study viewed those identities as really intersectional. These were the participants, if you think about it, they used social justice discourse. Maybe they were the students involved in the cultural centers on campus. Maybe they were taking the women's studies and ethnic studies courses, and they talked about, my identities, they're all there. As Haley said, I can't really break them apart. But there were these 4 other perspectives that were not necessarily intersectional, right? So there was an interactive perspective that said, okay, these 2 identities are distinct, but maybe they inform each other in some way. So the processes around disclosure, that's a big part of, it can be around both disability and queer and trans identities. And one participant talked about, he framed it, Elijah, as sort of being closeted twice and creating this increased psychological stress. Some participants positioned their identities as overlapping. So they said, like as Madison said in this instance, the queer communities have a lot of disabled people and vice versa. It's pretty normal. So sort of the co-occurrence of these identities and noting that that is a common experience. Some folks use sort of analogies, a parallel perspective to sort of compare the identities. So again, on disclosure, a participant, Danny, talked about in both my disability and sexuality, I have to come out over and over and over again. That is certainly one takeaway, I think, from my research, that these disclosure processes and decisions weigh heavily. on students. And it's something that, it's not a one-time process. It's something that folks may be navigating every day or in each new space, right? Each new classroom they enter, each new sort of microclimate in higher ed. Lastly is this oppositional perspective, and that's where there's really a sense of identity conflict. And so one participant, Will, he described it as a constant clash of the two different identities. So one takeaway here is that many students evidence like they weren't just in one of these boxes, right? So they may have multiple, depending on the context, they're adopting these multiple perspectives. But you can also see the complications, just how complex some of these identity management processes are. And are we as professionals, our services, our offices, our curriculum, are they set up to acknowledge some of these complexities? Do we even know how to acknowledge these complexities, right? It's something that participants also talked about. They might go to the Disability Resource Center, but they didn't always feel like that was an accepting space around their LGBT identities, or maybe they go to a gender and sexuality center that is not accessible or doesn't have programming around disability. So I think it really challenges some of those single identity boxes that we sometimes create in higher ed. And that's not really how we live our lives, right? We don't live in those single boxes. Um, there's a few other slides I want to get to before Q&A. I'm mindful of time, so I'm gonna skip over some of this, but suffice to say, it's all on the Google Scholar page. I've enjoyed looking at how students build their identities online, in particular, how they go to social media, which had its pros and cons, right? And I shared a bit about navigating disclosure as well. There's also, this is a concept from disability studies, the idea of crypt time. And so it's an argument that time works differently for disabled bodies and minds. And I studied this in relation to queer and trans students with disabilities, and they really resisted a lot of the ways. If you think about our higher ed institutions, time is a big factor. So we say, complete your degree faster because that's more affordable. We say everyone's going to graduate in 4 years after they enter. Think about the assumptions that are laden in that, right? That, oh, everyone will be a full-time student and doesn't have to find other income, or everyone will be able to, do that 15-hour credit hour course load, right? So I really saw from students in my study that they really bristled at that. And they said, hey, we're sort of creating something on our own timeline, a crypt timeline, if you will, that, is different than how the institution sort of frames time. And there's a whole field of critical temporalities that it sometimes hurts my head, but it's a very fascinating field of study. So some of my other studies have looked at some of the marginalization, particularly in classrooms. I've done some work also looking at student experiences in the STEM fields. I think this is the very last snapshot I wanted to share with you, and it is new. It's not even, I can't even say it's hot off the press because it's still in press. And I've been part of a study in North Carolina looking at transfer students, so students transferring from community college to university. And so this particular publication with Brett Nachman, who's at the University of Pittsburgh, phenomenal scholar in the disability space, look him up. So we collaborated and looked at how there were two main themes. We looked at how students were navigating disability identities and diagnoses from the high school K-12 space to community college through to university. Um, and there's this one example from a participant named Clay, who talked about, Clay was in and out of different community colleges, so sort of a swirling student, and that, getting diagnosed, getting an ADHD diagnosis and then the medications functioned as really vital supports for him. This is an important point too, because I think you heard me like criticize the medical model earlier. And I think it's not that, these are legitimate supports, right? Those are material reality, pieces that will support a student like Clay. So let's, it's not about throwing it all out, but sort of reimagining and thinking more about it, because these were really vital for Clay, and talking about how that really changed his trajectory. And then he did go on to transfer to a university. The second piece was about the second theme in our work that's going to come out soon was about moving from like a binary notion of independence, like dependence versus independence, to a more holistic notion of interdependence for students in their studies and in their lives. And so there was an example from Sawyer, talked about their vision starting to deteriorate and again when they were at community college. And that was actually a turning point for them because they were able to learn how to use assistive technology. Again, technology can be positive, technology can be negative, right? This is a positive example. Sawyer talked about learning to advocate. So I love to see, when Sawyer said this about if something's not working for me. So, they learn study skills, assistive technology skills, and skill in advocacy and speaking up for themselves. So I'm very excited about this piece. It's coming out soon, maybe mid-year, hopefully sooner. Um, the time to publication is always slower than I would like, but wanted to give you sort of a sneak peek, sneak preview of that. So I have been filibustering for a bit here and wanted to ask you, if you don't mind, this is just the second and final poll everywhere of, any ideas that you've got. Maybe it's something you're already thinking about before today or that you're already doing, but, any ideas of big or small, how do you center disability, take disability from the margins to the center, and support disabled students, on your campus? Again, no idea too small or too large, but just curious to hear what's on your mind after hearing a bit about this and anything maybe you're already working on that you're excited about. So I'll give folks a moment to access that. Okay, great. So we got responses starting to come in. Thank you all. So partnerships on campus, yeah, yep, asking those questions about what are we doing or not doing yet to support disabled students. Absolutely. Disability is still about accommodations, but I like the idea of supporting it as an identity. Yeah, that's the thing that with all of these models, it's not that, one is the best or that we need to throw out the other ones, but I like to push us toward thinking holistically, right? And you're right, the reality of a lot of the ways that disability is taken up in higher ed is around the accommodations process. So we want that process to be, that's not going anywhere. We want that to be, a strong inclusive process, right? Where we see folks as full in their full humanities. Yeah, including disability with other communities, having a big coalition, absolutely. Looking for where you can find those common cause on campus, common, sort of partners that you might engage with. So excellent. Well, thank you. I know some folks may still be typing, and I'm gonna, oh, here's another one. Sharing universal design strategies for syllabi teaching curriculum. Absolutely, that's one of the considerations I'm going to go over in just a moment. Um, Investing time and attention in the disabled community and participate in growing that community. Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you all very much for sharing those. And just for the sake of time, I'm going to move us forward, but hope you'll consider kind of pondering this question. I wanted to mention again, in terms of ideas that you might consult, there's a special issue of JPED. It's the Journal of Post-Secondary Ed and Disability that I was a co-editor of a few years back. It has some great ideas, especially for those of you, if you're in a disability resource space or if you're interested in advocating. And I'm going to put the link in the chat to that. It's a free PDF, freely accessible. You don't have to go through the library or anything. And these are just a few of the titles of some of the articles there. So I love, there's some of these, like some of it is just so practical of like, how do you persuasive metrics? How do you use caseload benchmarking and data to advocate for your budget? So a very sort of nuts and bolts piece about that. How do you use survey data to support students with disabilities? How do you do program development that centers autistic students? So again, it's just a few years old, but I think still has a lot of great insights there. Um, as we start to get toward the end here, we've talked about supporting students holistically, focusing on affordability of the institution, fully funding and staffing those disability services offices, so that it's hopefully, yes, it's the accommodations process, but hopefully they can do more. And there's also this movement of disability cultural centers in higher ed that sort of is outside of the medical and legal model. So you might, even if you don't open up a new office, you might do, a program or an event around that to get that conversation started. Um, a participant read my mind with the idea of universal design practices, which we didn't talk as much about today. That could be a whole talk in and of itself. I also want to encourage you to think about those disabled faculty and staff. It's the right thing to do to support them, and it also supports student success. And I also, just lastly on current events, right? We're seeing a lot of chilling efforts and over-compliance efforts in higher education, and I'm afraid disability is getting swept up in those efforts. So I think institutions, a lot of them are going to go beyond whatever is the final legal word. And you might think, okay, if a disability service offices are still there, but if a cultural center is taken away, or an LGBT center, or a women's center, that affects disabled students as well, right? I was surprised to see accessibility. They added that to the DEI acronym in the executive order. I don't yet know how that's going to play out because some of the state laws on this front have explicitly exempted disability and said disability is not what they're targeting. So again, I know that's a larger conversation, but I had to comment on that. I know we have just a few minutes for questions, but thought we could move in if there's any comments, questions in our last few minutes.
I will, first of all, thank you for such a robust presentation. This was fantastic. I'm going to stop the recording here. Um, for folks that are watching the recording, you can find this and other resources at the acm.edu website, particularly under our professional development tab.